Imagine declaring war on someone and then completely forgetting about it for 335 years. Imagine fighting the longest war in human history without firing a single shot, without a single casualty, without even remembering you were at war. This actually happened, and the story is so bizarre, so absurd, so perfectly ridiculous that when people finally realized what had occurred, they could barely believe it was real. This is the story of the war between the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly, a tiny archipelago off the southwestern tip of England. A war that began in 1651 during one of the bloodiest periods in British history. A war that was forgotten almost immediately. A war that technically continued for over 3 centuries, while both sides went about their lives in perfect peace. A war that only ended in 1986 when a historian stumbled across the truth and realized that these two places were still, legally, at war. But this isn't just a quirky historical footnote. This is a story about how wars start, how they're forgotten, how legal technicalities can create absurd situations, and how sometimes the most important historical events are the ones that almost didn't happen at all. This is a story about the English Civil War, about Dutch naval power, about pirates and political intrigue, about tiny islands caught in the crossfire of great power conflicts. This is a story about how history gets recorded and how it gets lost. And ultimately, this is a story that reveals something profound about the nature of war itself. So let's go back to 1651. Back to a time when England was tearing itself apart, when kings lost their heads and republics rose and fell, when the seas around Britain were contested by multiple navies and pirates roamed freely. Back to understand how a war could be declared and then so completely forgotten that it would take over 300 years for anyone to notice. Because if we want to understand how the Netherlands ended up at war with a tiny group of islands for longer than the United States has existed as a country, we need to understand the chaos of 17th century Britain. We need to understand the politics of the Dutch Republic, and we need to understand the strategic importance of a few small islands that most people have never heard of. This is the complete story of the 335 Years' War, the longest war in history, the war where nobody died, the war that everyone forgot. And I promise you, by the end, you'll never think about war, peace, or historical memory the same way again. Part 1. Understanding the English Civil War. To understand how this bizarre war began, we need to understand the chaos that was consuming England in the middle of the 17th century. Because the 335 Years' War was a side effect, an afterthought, a tiny ripple from one of the most traumatic periods in English history, the English Civil War. Or more accurately, the English Civil Wars. Because there were actually 3 separate conflicts between 1642 and 1651. Wars that would reshape England, execute a king, establish a republic, and create political and religious divisions that echo even today. Let's set the scene. England in the early 1600s was ruled by the Stuart dynasty, King James I, and then his son Charles I. These were kings who believed deeply in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were appointed by God and answered only to God, that they had absolute authority over their kingdoms. That parliament, that representative body of nobles and commoners, existed only at the pleasure of the king and could be dismissed whenever convenient. This political philosophy was going to create enormous problems. Charles I came to the throne in 1625. From the beginning, his reign was troubled. He fought expensive wars that accomplished little. He demanded taxes that Parliament was reluctant to grant. He tried to rule without Parliament entirely, dismissing them and attempting to govern through royal decree. For 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, Charles ruled without calling Parliament at all. This period became known as the personal rule, or less charitably, the 11 Years' Tyranny. But ruling without Parliament meant ruling without the power to raise taxes through normal channels. Charles had to find creative ways to fund his government. He revived ancient feudal taxes. He sold monopolies and offices. He imposed ship money, a tax traditionally only levied on coastal areas during wartime, across the entire country during peacetime. These measures were deeply unpopular. They were seen as illegal, as violations of English law and custom. Resentment built. And then there was religion. This is crucial to understanding what happened. England in the 1600s was a Protestant country, having broken with the Catholic Church under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. But what kind of Protestant country? This was bitterly contested. The Church of England was a compromise, retaining bishops and ceremony that many Protestants saw as too similar to Catholicism. A growing movement of Puritans wanted to purify the Church, to strip away ritual and hierarchy, to create a simpler, more democratic form of Christianity. Charles, however, along with his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, pushed in the opposite direction. They emphasized ceremony, ritual, the authority of bishops. To Puritans, this looked like creeping Catholicism. It looked like betrayal of the Protestant Reformation, and it fueled paranoia and resistance. The crisis came to a head over Scotland. Charles tried to impose English religious practices on Scotland, which had its own Presbyterian church with very different traditions. The Scots revolted. Charles needed money to fight the Scots. He was forced to call Parliament in 1640, but Parliament, angry after 11 years of being dismissed, refused to simply grant money. They demanded reforms. They demanded limits on royal power. They demanded religious changes. Charles dissolved this Parliament after only 3 weeks. It became known as the Short Parliament, but Charles still needed money. The Scottish War was going badly. He was forced to call Parliament again later in 1640. This time, Parliament refused to be dismissed. They passed laws making it impossible for the king to dissolve Parliament without its consent. They impeached Charles's chief ministers. They abolished the special courts Charles had used to punish his opponents. They dismantled the machinery of royal absolutism. This Parliament, which would sit for 13 years, became known as the Long Parliament. Charles was losing control. Factions formed. On one side, those who supported the king, who believed in royal authority, who feared that Parliament was becoming too powerful, who worried about disorder and revolution. These became the Royalists, or Cavaliers. On the other side, those who supported Parliament, who believed the king had overstepped his bounds, who wanted religious reform, who saw themselves as defending English liberties. These became the Parliamentarians, or Roundheads. In 1642, the conflict turned violent. Charles tried to arrest 5 members of Parliament who opposed him. They escaped. Charles fled London. Both sides began raising armies. And England descended into civil war. Not a clean war between 2 organized states. A messy, brutal civil war where families were divided, where brother fought brother, where communities were torn apart. A war that would rage across England, Scotland, and Ireland for 9 years. The first phase of the war, from 1642 to 1646, saw Royalist and Parliamentarian armies clash across the country. Initially, the Royalists had advantages. Many nobles supported the king. The officer class was largely Royalist. Charles held the north and west of England, but Parliament held London, the economic heart of the nation. and Parliament controlled the navy. This would prove decisive. Parliament also had Oliver Cromwell, a country gentleman and Puritan who emerged as a brilliant military leader. Cromwell organized the new model army, a professional fighting force unlike anything England had seen. Disciplined, well-trained, ideologically motivated, the new model army defeated the Royalists in a series of battles. By 1646, Charles was in custody. The First Civil War was over. But what to do with the captured king? Parliament was divided. Some wanted to negotiate with Charles, to reach a settlement that limited his power but kept the monarchy. Others wanted more radical change. Charles, meanwhile, tried to play different factions against each other. He negotiated in bad faith, making promises he had no intention of keeping, trying to regain his throne through manipulation and intrigue. In 1648, Charles made a secret deal with the Scots. He promised to impose Presbyterianism on England if they would help him regain his throne. The Scots invaded England. This sparked the Second Civil War, but it was brief. Cromwell's forces quickly defeated the Scottish army, and this time many in Parliament and the army had had enough of Charles. They saw him as a man of blood, as someone who would continue to provoke wars, who could never be trusted, who had to be removed permanently. In January 1649, Charles I was put on trial for treason against his own people. This was revolutionary, unthinkable. Kings did not stand trial. Kings were above the law. But Charles was tried, convicted, and on January 30th, 1649, he was beheaded outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. The execution of a king shocked all of Europe. It demonstrated that no authority was absolute, that even monarchs could be held accountable. It was a moment that changed political history. With the king dead, England became a republic. The Commonwealth of England, the monarchy, was abolished. The House of Lords was abolished. England would be ruled by Parliament and by the Council of State. In practice, Oliver Cromwell emerged as the dominant figure. Though he refused the title of king, England had become something entirely new and frightening to the established powers of Europe. But the wars weren't over. Charles I had a son, also named Charles, who claimed the throne as Charles II. Young Charles was in exile, but he had support. Royalists in Ireland and Scotland continued to fight. The new English Republic had to consolidate its power. In 1649 and 1650, Cromwell led brutal campaigns in Ireland, crushing royalist resistance with infamous massacres at Drogheda and Wexford. Then he turned to Scotland. By 1650, young Charles II had allied with the Scots. He agreed to accept the Scottish Presbyterian Church in exchange for their support. A Scottish army prepared to invade England to restore the monarchy. This was the backdrop, the context, the chaos in which our story of the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly takes place. England, in 1650, was a republic at war, fighting royalists, fighting Scots, trying to establish legitimacy, surrounded by hostile monarchies in Europe who saw the execution of a king as an abomination. It was in this environment that a tiny group of islands off the coast of Cornwall became relevant to international politics. Part 2. The strategic importance of the Isles of Scilly. Now, let me introduce you to the Isles of Scilly. If you're not familiar with them, and most people aren't, they're an archipelago of about 140 islands and rocky outcrops lying approximately 28 miles off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, England. Only 5 of the islands are inhabited. The total land area is just over 6 square miles. The population in the 17th century was perhaps 1,500 people. In our modern time, it's around 2,000 permanent residents. These are beautiful islands. Mild climate due to the Gulf Stream, white sandy beaches, clear waters, rocky coastlines. They're a tourist destination now, known for their natural beauty and relaxed atmosphere. In the 17th century, they were remote, isolated, difficult to reach, and strategically important in ways that seemed disproportionate to their tiny size. Why did these islands matter? Location. The Isles of Scilly sit at the entrance to the English Channel, the western approaches. Any ship traveling between the Atlantic Ocean and the Channel, heading to or from Bristol, London, or any port in southern England, passed near the Isles of Scilly. This made them a perfect base for privateers, pirates, or naval forces wanting to control or disrupt maritime trade. A small fleet based in Scilly could intercept merchant shipping, levy tolls, or attack enemy vessels. In an age when sea power meant national power, when trade was the lifeblood of economies, controlling the Isles of Scilly meant controlling a choke point. The islands also served as a refuge. Ships could shelter there during storms. Fleets could resupply. And for political exiles or defeated forces, the islands offered a remote base where they might regroup beyond the immediate reach of their enemies. This combination of location and isolation made the Isles of Scilly punching far above their weight in terms of strategic importance. By 1651, the English civil wars had reached the Isles of Scilly. The islands had been held by royalist forces throughout the conflict. They served as a base for royalist privateers who raided parliamentarian shipping. The governor of the islands was Sir John Grenville, a committed royalist. Even after Charles I was executed, even after most of England had fallen to Parliament, the Isles of Scilly remained royalist. They were one of the last royalist strongholds in the British Isles. From Scilly, royalist privateers sailed out to attack merchant ships. They captured vessels, stole cargo, disrupted trade. They were essentially state-sanctioned pirates, operating under letters of marque from the exiled Charles II to Parliament. These royalist privateers were a serious problem. They were damaging England's economy. They were embarrassing the new republic, and they were providing the exiled king with both funds and a symbol of continued resistance. Parliament needed to deal with the Isles of Scilly. They needed to eliminate this royalist base. They needed to end the privateering. And they needed to demonstrate that the Republic controlled all of England, even remote islands. So in 1651, Parliament prepared an expedition to capture the Isles of Scilly. But here's where it gets interesting, because at the same time, the Netherlands had its own problems with the Isles of Scilly. To understand why, we need to talk about the Dutch Republic and its relationship with England during this chaotic period. Part 3. The Dutch Republic and its interests. The Netherlands in the 17th century, or more properly the Dutch Republic, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, was one of the great powers of Europe. This may surprise modern audiences who think of the Netherlands as a small country, but in the 1600s, the Dutch Republic was an economic and naval superpower. They had the most advanced economy in Europe, the largest merchant fleet in the world, a sophisticated financial system, a powerful navy, colonies and trading posts across the globe. The Dutch East India Company and Dutch West India Company were commercial empires unto themselves. The Dutch Republic had won its independence from Spain through a long and brutal war of liberation that lasted from 1568 to 1648, the 80 Years' War. The Dutch fought for their freedom, for their Protestant religion, and for their economic interests against the Catholic Habsburg Spanish Empire. By the middle of the 17th century, they had succeeded. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 formally recognized Dutch independence. The Dutch Republic was free, wealthy, and powerful. Dutch economic power rested on trade. The Dutch were the middlemen of Europe. They carried goods from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, from the Americas to Asia. Dutch merchant ships were everywhere, and they needed those shipping lanes to be safe. They needed to be able to trade freely. Anything that threatened Dutch merchant shipping threatened the foundation of Dutch prosperity. Now, the relationship between the Dutch Republic and England during the English Civil Wars was complicated. The Dutch were fellow Protestants, which created some natural sympathy with the parliamentary cause. Many English Puritans had found refuge in the Netherlands during periods of persecution. There were cultural and religious connections. However, the Dutch were also pragmatists. They wanted stability. They wanted to maintain trade, and they were wary of radical political experiments like executing kings and abolishing monarchies. When the English Commonwealth was established, the Dutch Republic recognized it diplomatically. They needed to maintain relations with whoever controlled England. Trade was too important. But the relationship was tense. There was commercial rivalry. Dutch and English merchants competed for the same trade routes, the same markets. There was also naval competition. Both nations had powerful fleets, and both nations were protective of their maritime interests. And this brings us to the problem of the Isles of Scilly. Dutch merchant ships regularly sailed through the western approaches. They carried goods to and from the Mediterranean, from the Baltic, from the Atlantic trade routes. And in 1650 and 1651, Dutch ships sailing through these waters were being attacked by royalist privateers based in the Isles of Scilly. Now, why would royalist privateers attack Dutch ships? The Dutch Republic was officially neutral in the English Civil Wars. But neutrality didn't matter much to desperate royalists who needed money and supplies. Dutch merchant ships were tempting targets. They carried valuable cargo. They were often lightly armed, and the royalists could rationalize attacks by claiming the Dutch were trading with the parliamentary regime, thus supporting the rebellion against the legitimate king. Dutch ships were captured. Cargoes were seized. Dutch sailors were imprisoned or killed. The Dutch government received complaints from merchants. They sent diplomatic protests to the royalist authorities in Scilly. They demanded compensation and an end to the attacks. But the royalists in Scilly had little incentive to listen. They were fighting for their survival. They needed money, and they didn't particularly care about offending the Dutch Republic. By early 1651, the Dutch were getting fed up. They had tried diplomacy. It hadn't worked. Their ships continued to be attacked. Their trade was being disrupted. Something needed to be done. The States General of the Netherlands, the governing body of the Dutch Republic, debated what action to take. Some suggested sending warships to protect Dutch merchant convoys. Others suggested negotiating with the English Parliament to resolve the situation. But the simplest solution seemed to be to send a small naval squadron to the Isles of Scilly to demand that the royalists stop attacking Dutch ships. And this is where the absurdity begins. Because in March 1651, the Dutch Republic sent a fleet commanded by Admiral Martin Harpertsoen Tromp to English waters. Tromp was one of the greatest Dutch admirals, a hero of the wars against Spain, a brilliant naval tactician. His mission was to protect Dutch merchant shipping and to deal with the royalist privateering problem. Tromp sailed his fleet to the Isles of Scilly. He anchored off the islands, and he sent a message to Sir John Grenville, the royalist governor. The message was straightforward: stop attacking Dutch ships. Return the captured Dutch vessels and cargoes. Provide compensation for losses, or else. Grenville, from his perspective, was in no position to comply. He answered to Charles II, the exiled king. He was fighting for the royalist cause. He needed the income from privateering. And frankly, He probably didn't take the Dutch threat too seriously. The Isles of Scilly were fortified. They could be defended, and Grenville may have calculated that the Dutch wouldn't actually attack, that this was just bluff and posturing. He was wrong. When Grenville refused the Dutch demands, when negotiations broke down, Admiral Tromp did something that would have consequences nobody could have predicted. On March 30th, 1651, Admiral Tromp, acting on the authority of the States General of the Netherlands, declared war on the Isles of Scilly. Let me emphasize how strange this is. The Dutch Republic declared war not on England, not on the Royalist faction, not on the Commonwealth, but specifically on the Isles of Scilly, a declaration of war against a group of tiny islands. This was unusual, to say the least. Normally, wars are declared between sovereign states, but the legal situation was confused. England was in the middle of a civil war. There was no universally recognized government. The Royalists in Scilly claimed to represent the legitimate king. The Dutch, by declaring war on Scilly specifically, rather than on England, were trying to thread a needle. They wanted to take action against the privateers without creating a full conflict with England. So Admiral Tromp declared war on the Isles of Scilly. And then something even more absurd happened. Almost immediately after declaring war, Tromp received new orders from the States General. The situation had changed. The English Parliament had decided to send its own expedition to capture the Isles of Scilly. The Parliamentary Navy was preparing to attack the islands. The Dutch, not wanting to get caught in the middle of an English domestic conflict, not wanting to risk a clash with parliamentary forces, decided to withdraw. Tromp sailed away. The Dutch fleet left the Isles of Scilly without firing a shot, without engaging in any combat, without doing anything beyond delivering the declaration of war. The Dutch decided to let Parliament deal with the Royalists. From a Dutch perspective, this made sense. Parliament would eliminate the privateering base. Dutch ships would be safe. The problem would be solved without the Dutch having to fight. And indeed, within months, a parliamentary fleet under Admiral Robert Blake arrived at the Isles of Scilly. Blake was an extraordinary naval commander, one of the greatest in English history. He blockaded the islands. He bombarded the fortifications. And by June 1651, the Royalists surrendered. Sir John Grenville and the Royalist forces evacuated. The Isles of Scilly came under parliamentary control. The privateering base was eliminated. Dutch ships were no longer attacked. From the Dutch perspective, the problem was solved. The Royalists who had been attacking their ships were gone. The new authorities in Scilly, the parliamentary forces, had no reason to attack Dutch shipping. Trade could resume safely. There was no need for continued conflict. The declaration of war had served its purpose. It had demonstrated Dutch seriousness. And now, it was irrelevant. And here's the critical point. Nobody thought to formally end the war. The Dutch had declared war on the Isles of Scilly in March 1651, but they never signed a peace treaty. They never issued a formal declaration ending hostilities. They just moved on. Everyone assumed the matter was settled. Why would you need a peace treaty when there had been no fighting, when the political situation had completely changed, when the whole issue was clearly resolved? This assumption, this failure to formally end a war that had never really begun, would have consequences that nobody could have imagined. Part 4. The Forgotten War. 3 centuries of peace. So the Dutch declared war on the Isles of Scilly in 1651 and then sailed away. The Isles of Scilly were captured by English parliamentary forces. Life went on. And everyone forgot about the declaration of war. For 335 years. How is this possible? How can a war be forgotten? Let's walk through what happened and why nobody noticed. First, understand that international law in the 17th century was not what it is today. There was no United Nations, no International Court of Justice, no comprehensive system for recording treaties and declarations. Wars were declared, often informally. Peace treaties were signed, often ambiguously. The whole system was ad hoc and poorly documented. It was entirely possible for a declaration of war to fall through the cracks, especially one as unusual as a declaration of war against a group of islands rather than a nation. Second, the declaration of war was made during an extraordinarily chaotic period. England was in the middle of a civil war. Governments were changing. Records were scattered. The royalist regime that the Dutch had technically declared war against ceased to exist when Parliament captured the islands. From a legal perspective, did the declaration of war even remain valid after the party it was directed against disappeared? Nobody was quite sure, and nobody really cared enough to figure it out. Third, there were no consequences to the declaration remaining technically active. The Dutch and the English, and later the British, after the Union of England and Scotland in 1707, continued to have normal diplomatic and economic relations. Sometimes they were allies. Sometimes they were rivals. They fought several Anglo-Dutch wars in the late 1600s, actual wars with actual battles. But these were separate conflicts with separate causes. The forgotten declaration of war against the Isles of Scilly was irrelevant to real-world politics. Fourth, the Isles of Scilly themselves reverted to being quiet, peaceful islands. They were no longer a base for privateers. They were no longer strategically important in the way they had been during the Civil War. They became a backwater, a remote archipelago known mainly for farming, fishing, and occasional shipwrecks. The population lived their lives in complete peace. Nobody on the islands was aware they were technically at war with the Netherlands. Nobody in the Netherlands was aware they were technically at war with the Isles of Scilly. The years passed. Decades became centuries. The 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s. Through all this time, through wars and revolutions and the rise and fall of empires, through industrialization and modernization, through 2 world wars, the technical state of war between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly continued, not because anyone wanted it to, not because it served any purpose, simply because nobody had ever formally ended it. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. During those 335 years, there were actually moments when the Dutch and the British did sign peace treaties, ending other conflicts. The Peace of Westminster in 1654 ended the First Anglo-Dutch War. The Treaty of Breda in 1667 ended the Second Anglo-Dutch War. The Treaty of Westminster in 1674 ended the Third Anglo-Dutch War. Multiple opportunities to clean up loose ends, to formalize the end of all hostilities. But nobody remembered the declaration of war against the Isles of Scilly. It never came up. It was lost in the archives. Meanwhile, life on the Isles of Scilly went on. The population farmed and fished. They built communities. They weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical. The islands were too remote to be heavily involved in most of English and later British history. They were affected by national events, of course. Young men from the islands served in British wars. The islands participated in the broader British economy, but they were peripheral, quiet, peaceful. The relationship between Britain and the Netherlands evolved. Sometimes allies, sometimes neutral, occasionally adversaries, but increasingly interconnected through trade, culture, and eventually through shared democratic values and NATO membership in the 20th century. The Netherlands and the United Kingdom became close partners. Nobody on either side thought about the Isles of Scilly being at war with the Netherlands. Why would they? It was absurd. It had never been a real war. It had been a brief diplomatic incident 3 centuries ago, that had resolved itself. And so the forgotten war continued. The longest war in recorded history. A war with no battles, no casualties, no military operations, no impact whatsoever on the lives of anyone involved. A war that existed only in legal technicality, in faded documents in archives that nobody read, until 1986. Part 5. The Discovery and the Peace Treaty. In 1986, a historian named Roy Duncan was researching the history of the Isles of Scilly. Duncan was a local historian, someone fascinated by the island's past. He was digging through archives, reading old documents, piecing together the story of the islands during the English Civil War period. And he came across something remarkable, a reference to Admiral Trump's declaration of war in 1651. Duncan read the document. He researched further, and he realized something extraordinary. There was no record of this war ever being formally ended. No peace treaty, no declaration terminating hostilities. The declaration of war was still, technically, legally in effect. The Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly were still at war. After 335 years, now, Duncan could have simply noted this as an amusing historical footnote and moved on. An interesting bit of trivia, a quirk of history. But Duncan had a sense of humor and a flair for publicity. He decided to bring this to public attention. He contacted the Dutch embassy in London. He explained his discovery, and he suggested, with tongue firmly in cheek, that perhaps it was time to formally end this war. The Dutch embassy staff must have been bemused. They verified Duncan's research. They checked their own archives, and they confirmed that, yes, technically, there had never been a formal end to hostilities. The legal state of war, however meaningless, still existed. This was, they recognized, delightfully absurd, and it presented an opportunity for a bit of good-natured international relations. A chance to generate positive press and celebrate the friendship between the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. So the Dutch agreed. They would send a representative to the Isles of Scilly to sign a formal peace treaty. They would end the war. After 335 years, peace would finally come to the longest conflict in history. The event was scheduled for April 17, 1986. The peace signing became a media event. Journalists from Britain and the Netherlands descended on the Isles of Scilly. This tiny archipelago, population barely over 2,000, suddenly found itself at the center of international attention. The story was perfect for the media. A forgotten war, an absurdly long duration, a peaceful resolution. It had humor, history, and human interest. It was a feel-good story in an era when the Cold War was still creating very real tensions. Here was a war that could end with everyone smiling. On April 17, 1986, the Dutch ambassador to the United Kingdom, Jonkheer Rijn Heidekoper, traveled to the Isles of Scilly. He was welcomed by local officials, by Roy Duncan the historian, by islanders curious about this unusual event. A formal ceremony was held. Speeches were made. There was much laughter and good humor. Everyone involved was enjoying the absurdity and the positive spirit. And then, in front of cameras and journalists, the Dutch ambassador and the chairman of the Council of the Isles of Scilly signed a formal peace treaty. The document declared that 335 years of hostilities were now concluded, that peace and friendship existed between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly, that this remarkable chapter of history was now closed. Champagne was served. There was a celebration. The islanders and the Dutch visitors toasted peace and friendship. The media coverage was extensive and universally positive. The story ran in newspapers and television news around the world. The longest war in history had ended without a single shot being fired. without a single casualty, with nothing but goodwill and laughter. Roy Duncan, the historian who discovered the forgotten war, was celebrated for his research and his initiative. The Isles of Scilly gained international recognition. The Dutch embassy scored a public relations victory, and everyone involved had a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. The day peace came to the Isles of Scilly after 3 centuries of war. But now let's step back and think about what this story really means. Because the 335 Years' War, for all its humor and absurdity, reveals something important about war, peace, international relations, and how we remember history. Part 6. What this war reveals about international relations. The 335 Years' War is funny. It's absurd. It makes for a great story, but it also teaches us serious lessons if we look deeper. Let's explore what this forgotten war reveals about how nations interact, how conflicts begin and end, and how legal fictions can take on lives of their own. First, this war demonstrates how easily conflicts can start without clear purpose or intent. Admiral Tromp declared war on the Isles of Scilly out of frustration and as a way to apply pressure. It was a diplomatic tool, a threat designed to force compliance. Tromp likely never intended to actually wage war. The declaration was meant to demonstrate seriousness, to show that the Dutch were willing to take action if their ships continued to be attacked. It was a form of coercive diplomacy. But here's the problem with threats. Once made, they create obligations and expectations. If you threaten action and then don't follow through, you lose credibility. If you make formal declarations, they enter the legal record. Tromp's declaration of war was an official act of the Dutch Republic. It was recorded. It had legal status. And even though Tromp immediately withdrew and never intended lasting conflict, the formal declaration remained in effect because nobody thought to formally revoke it. This pattern of conflicts beginning through escalating threats and misunderstandings rather than through clear, aggressive intent is common throughout history. Many wars start not because leaders rationally decide to fight, but because they box themselves into corners through threats and demands they feel they can't back down from without losing face. The 335 Years' War is an extreme and harmless example, but the mechanism is revealing. Second, this war shows how easily things can be forgotten. 335 years is a long time, long enough that every single person alive when the war was declared was long dead, long enough that governments had changed, borders had changed, the entire political landscape of Europe had transformed multiple times. How could anyone be expected to remember a declaration of war made in 1651 by 1751, let alone by 1951? But this raises uncomfortable questions. How much else has been forgotten? How many other legal obligations, treaties, agreements, and declarations have fallen through the cracks? How much of international law rests on foundations that nobody has examined in centuries? The answer is probably more than we'd like to think. International relations are built on layers of historical agreements, many poorly documented, some contradictory, some simply lost. This is why historians and archivists are important. They maintain institutional memory. They prevent societies from forgetting their obligations and their past. Roy Duncan's discovery of the forgotten war wasn't just amusing. It was a reminder that we need people who care about dusty documents and old records, because sometimes those records matter in unexpected ways. Third, this war demonstrates the difference between legal technicalities and practical reality. Legally, the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly were at war for 335 years. But practically, they were at peace. They had normal relations. Dutch people could visit the Isles of Scilly. Islanders could visit the Netherlands. There was trade, tourism, cultural exchange. The legal state of war had absolutely zero effect on real life. This happens more often than you might think. International law is full of technical states that don't match reality. Territorial disputes where the actual situation has been stable for decades but the legal dispute remains unresolved. Peace treaties that were never signed even though conflicts ended long ago. Agreements that are technically in force but universally ignored. The gap between legal status and practical reality can be enormous. This is both reassuring and concerning. Reassuring because it shows that practical common sense usually prevails over legal technicalities. People find ways to get along and do business regardless of what ancient documents say. But concerning because legal technicalities can sometimes be weaponized. A clever or malicious actor might dig up an old agreement or dispute and use it to create problems. Legal clarity matters, even if most of the time people just muddle through. Fourth, this war highlights how differently we treat conflict depending on scale and impact. The 335 Years' War is remembered fondly, joked about, celebrated. The peace treaty signing was a happy occasion. But this is only possible because the war never actually involved fighting. Nobody died, nobody suffered. It was a war in name only, a legal fiction without real-world consequences. Now contrast this with actual wars. The English civil wars that formed the backdrop to our story killed hundreds of thousands of people. The Anglo-Dutch wars of the late 1600s involved major naval battles and significant casualties. These are remembered, when they're remembered at all, with solemnity and sadness. War is hell, as the saying goes. Real war involves death, destruction, trauma, and suffering that echoes through generations. The fact that we can laugh about the 335 Years' War reveals an important truth. The essence of war is not the legal declaration, but the violence. A formal state of war without violence is a bureaucratic curiosity. Violence without formal declaration is still war in every meaningful sense. This reminds us to focus on substance over form. When evaluating conflicts, what matters is not whether war has been formally declared, but whether people are suffering and dying. Fifth, this forgotten war demonstrates the importance of closure and formal processes. Why did this war last 335 years? Simply because nobody formally ended it. The substantive issues were resolved in 1651 when the Royalist privateers were defeated. But the legal mechanism, the declaration of war, remained active because nobody completed the formal process of making peace. This seems trivial in this case, but it's not always trivial. Conflicts that don't end formally can create ongoing problems. Korea is still technically at war. The Korean War ended with an armistice in 1953, a ceasefire. But no peace treaty was ever signed. North and South Korea remain in a legal state of war 70 years later. This is not a mere curiosity. This legal state of war is used to justify military buildups, aggressive postures, and political rhetoric. It matters. Similarly, many territorial disputes persist partly because there was never formal closure. The parties involved never sat down and agreed on borders, compensation, or final status. They just stopped fighting and hoped time would resolve things. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Formal peace processes matter. Treaties matter. They create clarity. They establish new baselines. They allow societies to move forward rather than remaining stuck in limbo. Sixth, this war shows how humor and goodwill can transform historical grievances. When Roy Duncan discovered the forgotten war, he could have approached it in various ways. He could have written an academic paper that only historians would read. He could have ignored it as irrelevant. Instead, he saw an opportunity for positive engagement. He contacted the Dutch. He proposed a peace treaty. He used history to create a moment of connection and celebration. The Dutch could have dismissed this as silly, as beneath the dignity of their government. Instead, they embraced it. They sent their ambassador. They made it a media event. They used an absurd historical accident to strengthen friendly relations with Britain, and specifically with the Isles of Scilly. This is smart diplomacy. This is using soft power effectively. The lesson here is that nations and peoples can choose how to engage with their histories. They can nurse grievances and maintain hostilities, or they can find ways to reconcile and build friendship. The Netherlands and Britain have fought real wars against each other, wars that killed people and destroyed communities. But they chose to move past those conflicts, to become allies and partners. The peace treaty signing on the Isles of Scilly was a symbol of that broader reconciliation. It was a way of saying, we remember our history, but we're not prisoners of it. Seventh, this war reminds us that international relations are ultimately human endeavors. They're not just about states and institutions and legal frameworks. They're about people making decisions, sometimes wise, sometimes foolish, sometimes just forgetting things. Admiral Trump was a person who got frustrated with pirates and declared war perhaps more impulsively than he should have. The officials who didn't think to sign a peace treaty were people who assumed things would work themselves out. Roy Duncan was a person who loved local history and stumbled onto something remarkable. The Dutch ambassador who came to Scilly was a person who recognized an opportunity to do something memorable and positive. All of international relations, all of history, comes down to people. Fallible, forgetful, sometimes brilliant, sometimes ridiculous people. The grand structures of law and diplomacy rest on human foundations. And that means both that mistakes happen and that things can change. People can choose different paths. They can correct errors. They can build new relationships. This is hopeful. It means we're not trapped by historical determinism. We can, if we choose, make peace. Part 7. Comparing the forgotten war to real conflicts. To fully appreciate the 335 years war, it helps to compare it to other long-running conflicts. Because while this war holds the record for duration, there are many other conflicts that have persisted for decades or centuries, but with very different characteristics and consequences. Let's explore some comparisons. First, consider the 100 Years' War between England and France, which actually lasted 116 years, from 1337 to 1453. This was a real war. Multiple generations fought and died. Entire regions were devastated. Famous battles like Crécy, Agincourt, and Orleans are remembered centuries later. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of casualties, economic devastation, political upheaval. The 100 Years' War shaped both England and France fundamentally. The contrast with the 335 Years' War could not be more stark. One was 3 times longer, but had 0 casualties. The other was 3 times shorter, but killed countless people. Duration clearly matters less than intensity when we evaluate the significance and impact of conflicts. Second, consider the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. This spanned roughly 780 years, from 711 to 1492, depending on how you count. Multiple kingdoms, countless battles, shifting alliances, religious fervor, cultural transformation. The Reconquista defined Spanish and Portuguese identity. It shaped the religious and ethnic composition of the region. It created the Spanish Empire that would dominate the 16th century. 780 years of intermittent but often intense warfare that changed history. Again, compare this to our forgotten war. The Reconquista was shorter in duration, but its impact was immeasurable. The 335 Years' War had no impact at all. This reinforces that war's significance isn't measured by how long declarations remain technically in force, but by how much suffering is caused and how much history is altered. Third, consider frozen conflicts. These are disputes that are neither war nor peace, where the parties are still technically hostile, but active fighting has stopped. The Korean Peninsula, as mentioned earlier, Taiwan and mainland China, which have been separated since 1949 with no formal resolution, Israel and various Arab states, some of which have formal peace treaties and some of which remain in technical states of war. The India-Pakistan-Kashmir dispute, Nagorno-Karabakh before it flared up again, Cyprus, divided since 1974. These frozen conflicts share something with the 335 Years' War. They're situations where the formal legal status doesn't match the practical reality. There's not active fighting most of the time, but there's not formal peace either. The parties exist in limbo. However, unlike the completely forgotten war between the Netherlands and Scilly, these frozen conflicts have real consequences. They justify military buildups. They prevent normal relations. They create ongoing tensions that periodically erupt into violence. They trap populations in uncertainty. The difference is that in frozen conflicts, both sides remember they're in conflict. They maintain military forces along borders. They engage in hostile rhetoric. The conflict shapes their politics and policies. The 335 Years' War was unique because both sides completely forgot it existed. This made it harmless. Frozen conflicts remain harmful precisely because they're not forgotten. Fourth, consider wars that ended without formal peace treaties but where everyone understood peace had come. World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, formally concluding hostilities. But World War II is more complicated. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with Germany's surrender. The war in the Pacific ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender. But formal peace treaties weren't signed until years later. The Treaty of San Francisco with Japan wasn't signed until 1951, 6 years after fighting stopped. Germany didn't have a comprehensive peace treaty until the 2+4 agreement in 1990, 45 years after the war ended. Yet nobody says World War II lasted until 1990. Why not? Because everyone understood the war was over when the fighting stopped. The formal legal processes were important for resolving territorial disputes and establishing new borders, but they weren't necessary for people to recognize that peace had arrived. The fighting stopped. Occupation governments were established. Reconstruction began. Life moved on. This contrasts with the 335 Years' War, where neither formal peace treaty nor common understanding of peace existed initially, but both sides simply forgot they had ever been at war. Different mechanism, similar result. Both cases show that formal declarations matter less than practical reality, but also that formal closure serves important purposes in creating certainty and allowing people to fully move forward. Fifth, consider ongoing religious or ethnic conflicts that span centuries through cycles of violence and peace. Catholic-Protestant tensions in Christianity, which led to countless wars from the Reformation through the 30 Years' War and beyond. Sunni-Shia conflicts in Islam, which have periodically erupted into major wars. These aren't continuous wars, but recurring conflicts, rooted in deep religious and cultural divisions that persist across generations. These long-running tensions show that even when formal wars end, underlying issues can remain unresolved, creating conditions for future conflicts. The 335 Years' War is the opposite. There were no underlying tensions between the Dutch and the Isles of Scilly. The original issue, privateering attacks on Dutch shipping, was resolved in 1651. There was no reason for future conflict. The war continued only because of bureaucratic oversight, not because of real grievances. This is why it could end so easily with smiles and champagne. There was nothing to resolve except the paperwork. Sixth, consider territorial disputes that last for centuries. The Falkland Islands, claimed by Britain and Argentina, with dispute going back to the early 1800s and erupting into war in 1982. Gibraltar, held by Britain but claimed by Spain since 1713. Various island disputes in the South China Sea. These disputes persist because territory has value. Land, resources, strategic position, national pride all create incentives to maintain claims, even over long periods. The Isles of Scilly case is different because the Dutch never claimed the islands. They didn't want the territory. They just wanted the attacks on their ships to stop. Once that was achieved, they had no further interest in Scilly. There was no territorial dispute to maintain. This is why the war could be so completely forgotten. Neither side had any incentive to remember it. These comparisons reveal that the 335 Years' War is unique not just in its length, but in its complete lack of substance. Most long conflicts persist, either because fighting continues, or because underlying disputes remain unresolved, or because parties consciously maintain hostile stances. This war persisted despite having no active hostilities, no unresolved disputes, and no hostile intentions. It persisted purely through oversight. This makes it historically unique and fascinatingly absurd. Part 8. Life on the Isles of Scilly. During the war. While the legal state of war existed, what was life actually like on the Isles of Scilly during those 335 years? Let's walk through different periods and see how the islands evolved, completely oblivious to their technical status as a war zone. In the immediate aftermath of the Royalist defeat in 1651, the islands came under parliamentary control. Garrison troops were stationed there to ensure the islands wouldn't again become a Royalist base. Life was probably somewhat militarized, with soldiers present and the islands recovering from the brief conflict that had ended Royalist control. But the Dutch declaration of war, issued months before Parliament captured the islands, was already forgotten. The Dutch had no quarrel with parliamentary England. Trade resumed normally. Through the 1650s and 1660s, during the period of the Commonwealth and then the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II in 1660, the Isles of Scilly settled back into peaceful obscurity. The strategic importance the islands had during the Civil War faded. They were no longer a privateering base. They were no longer contested territory. They became, once again, a remote agricultural and fishing community. The population made their living from farming the limited arable land, from fishing the rich waters around the islands, and from occasional salvage operations when ships wrecked on the rocky coastline. The 1700s brought slow change. The islands remained poor and isolated. Travel to mainland Cornwall took hours by boat and was dangerous in bad weather. The population numbered around 1,000 to 2,000 people, spread across the inhabited islands. Street Mary's was and remains the largest island and the administrative center. The other inhabited islands, Street Martins, Street Agnes, Bryher, and Tresco, each had small communities. Life was hard. The soil was thin. Fresh water was limited. Storms could be devastating. But the islands had advantages. The mild climate, moderated by the Gulf Stream, allowed some crops to grow that couldn't survive on mainland Britain. Flowers, particularly narcissus and daffodils, became an important crop in later centuries. The waters provided fish and shellfish, and the isolation meant that island communities developed strong bonds and distinctive cultures. During the 1700s, the islands saw development of the shipbuilding industry. Small vessels were constructed for fishing and local transport. Pilot services developed, with islanders guiding ships through the dangerous waters around the archipelago. Wrecking and salvage remained part of the economy. When ships ran aground on the rocks, which happened regularly, islanders would salvage what they could. This had a somewhat unsavory reputation. There were allegations that islanders sometimes lured ships onto the rocks deliberately with false lights, though evidence for this is disputed. The 1800s brought gradual modernization. In 1834, Trinity House built the first major lighthouse on St. Agnes. This improved maritime safety significantly. More lighthouses followed. The Victorian era saw improved transportation connections with the mainland. Regular steamship services began. The Royal Mail established service to the islands. Communication became more reliable. The 1800s also brought administrative reforms. The islands had been governed by various arrangements over the centuries. In 1890, the Isles of Scilly became a single administrative unit. Local governance structures were formalized. Education improved, with the establishment of schools on the inhabited islands. The economic base diversified. Flower farming expanded significantly. The mild climate and early season gave Scilly flowers a competitive advantage in mainland markets. Narcissus bulbs were shipped to London and other cities where they commanded premium prices. This provided steady income for island families. Tourism began to develop. Wealthy Victorians discovered the islands as a destination for relaxation and natural beauty. Guest houses opened. Boats brought visitors seeking escape from industrial England. Through all of this, through the 1700s and 1800s, through agricultural development and early tourism, through administrative reforms and improved transportation, nobody on the Isles of Scilly had any idea they were technically at war with the Netherlands. Nobody in the Netherlands knew either. Dutch visitors came to the islands occasionally as tourists or sailors. They were welcomed normally. Trade between British and Dutch ports was extensive and unproblematic. The war existed only in forgotten archives. The 1900s brought more dramatic changes. The two world wars affected the islands. Young men from Scilly served in the British military. Some died in Flanders fields or on naval vessels. The islands themselves saw military installations. During World War II, coastal defenses were built. Troops were stationed. The islands were part of Britain's defensive perimeter. German submarines operated in the approaches. There was real danger, real war all around the islands. And here's an irony. During World War II, the Netherlands and the United Kingdom were allies fighting Nazi Germany. Dutch and British forces fought together. The Dutch government in exile operated from London. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands lived in Britain during the occupation of her country. Dutch and British pilots flew together in the RAF. Dutch and British soldiers fought together in Operation Market Garden and other campaigns. The Netherlands and Britain were partners in one of the most consequential conflicts in human history, all while technically the Isles of Scilly were at war with the Netherlands. Nobody knew, nobody cared, because the technical legal state was completely divorced from reality. During a real war, a global war against fascism, the forgotten 3-century-old declaration of war was entirely irrelevant. After World War II, The Isles of Scilly continued to develop as a tourist destination. The flower industry remained important, but tourism became the dominant economic activity. The islands marketed themselves as an unspoiled paradise. Beautiful beaches, clear waters, mild climate, relaxed pace of life. Visitor numbers increased through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Infrastructure improved. The airport on St. Mary's was expanded. Helicopter services began. More accommodation was built. The population remained relatively stable, around 2,000 permanent residents. Many worked in tourism, operating hotels, guest houses, boat tours, and other services. Some continued traditional activities like fishing. The islands developed a reputation as a place where time moved slower, where modern stresses didn't reach, where nature remained dominant. Through all of this modern development, through the expansion of tourism and the integration of the islands into the broader British economy, the forgotten war continued. Dutch tourists visited regularly, drawn by the same attractions as other Europeans. They were warmly welcomed. They enjoyed the beaches and the peace. They had no idea their country was officially at war with these islands. How could they? It was absurd. It was impossible to take seriously even if you knew about it, which nobody did. The islands developed sister city relationships with Dutch towns. Cultural exchanges happened. Students visited. Artists came to paint the landscapes. Dutch flowers and Scilly flowers, both famous, were compared and appreciated. Friendship and normal relations at every level, all while technically at war. This is what makes the story so remarkable. Life went on absolutely normally for 335 years. Generations lived and died. Communities evolved. Economies changed. Wars were fought, and peace was made. And through it all, a legal fiction of war existed that had absolutely no impact on anyone's life. It was the most meaningless war in history because it was forgotten by everyone involved. Until Roy Duncan, digging through archives in the 1980s, discovered it and decided to bring it to light. And even then, even when people learned about it, nobody treated it as a real conflict. Because it wasn't. It was a curiosity, a bit of historical trivia that made for a good story and an excuse for a pleasant ceremony. Part 9. The Peace Treaty Ceremony in Detail. Let's return to April 17, 1986, and examine in detail what happened when peace finally came to the Isles of Scilly. Because the ceremony itself is worth understanding as an example of creative diplomacy and the power of positive historical storytelling. The preparations began in the weeks leading up to the event. Once the Dutch embassy agreed to participate, arrangements had to be made. The Dutch ambassador's schedule had to be cleared. Travel to the islands had to be arranged. The local authorities on Scilly had to prepare for the ceremony and the media attention. Invitations were sent to local dignitaries, to Roy Duncan, the historian whose research had started everything, to residents who wanted to witness this unusual event. The media response was immediate and enthusiastic. British newspapers loved the story. A 335-year war ending peacefully? The longest war in history with no casualties? A conflict so forgotten that nobody had noticed it was still technically ongoing? This was perfect human interest material. British television news planned coverage. Dutch media also took interest. International press services picked up the story. By the time April 17th arrived, the Isles of Scilly were receiving more media attention than they had in decades. On the day itself, the weather cooperated. The Isles of Scilly are known for their mild climate, but also for their unpredictability. A ceremony held outdoors was always a gamble. But April 17th, 1986, was pleasant. Mild temperatures, light winds, partly cloudy skies, perfect conditions for an outdoor gathering. The Dutch ambassador, Jonkheer Rijn Heidekoper, arrived by helicopter. This itself was somewhat dramatic. Helicopters were relatively new to regular service to the islands, having only been introduced in the 1960s. The sight of a helicopter bringing a foreign ambassador to sign a peace treaty added to the sense of occasion. The ambassador was accompanied by embassy staff and by Dutch journalists who had traveled specifically to cover the event. He was greeted by Roy Duncan, the historian whose discovery had made all of this possible. Duncan had become something of a local celebrity. His research had put the Isles of Scilly on the international map. He had turned dusty archival work into a media event, and he was clearly enjoying every minute of it. Also present was the chairman of the Council of the Isles of Scilly, the local government body that would represent the islands in the peace treaty signing. The ceremony was held in a public space where residents and visitors could attend. Chairs were arranged. A table was set up for the signing. Flags were displayed, the Dutch tricolor and the Union Jack, symbols of the two nations involved. Though technically the treaty was between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly specifically, not the United Kingdom as a whole. But these diplomatic niceties were part of the charm. Speeches were made. The Dutch ambassador spoke about the long history of Dutch-British relations. He acknowledged the absurdity of the situation with good humor. He praised the spirit of the Isles of Scilly residents and thanked Roy Duncan for his diligent historical research. He expressed the friendship and mutual respect between the Dutch people and the people of Scilly. His speech was warm, witty, and perfectly pitched for the occasion. The chairman of the council responded. He welcomed the ambassador. He joked about the long and arduous conflict that had thankfully claimed no lives. He spoke about how the islands valued their connections with the Netherlands and with all of Europe. He thanked the Dutch for their willingness to participate in this ceremony and for their sense of humor. He celebrated the peace that was being formalized. Roy Duncan was invited to speak. He explained how he had made the discovery, his surprise at finding no record of a peace treaty, his decision to bring this to public attention. He expressed hope that this event would remind people that conflicts can end, that history can be used to build bridges rather than walls, that even the most obscure historical facts can have contemporary relevance. And then came the signing. The peace treaty, formally titled the Treaty of Peace between the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly, was presented. It was a short document. It acknowledged the declaration of war in 1651. It noted that 335 years had passed without hostilities. It declared that peace was hereby concluded. It expressed friendship and cooperation. Simple, straightforward, and delightfully unnecessary from a practical standpoint, but satisfying from a symbolic and legal perspective. The Dutch ambassador signed. The chairman of the council signed. Witnesses signed. Photographs were taken. The moment was captured for history. After 335 years, peace had officially come to the Isles of Scilly. The crowd applauded. There was laughter and smiles all around. It was a genuinely joyful moment. Champagne was served. This is traditional at diplomatic ceremonies, and it was certainly appropriate here. Toasts were made to peace, to friendship, to the Netherlands, to the Isles of Scilly, to Roy Duncan and his historical research, to the absurdity of it all. People mingled, Dutch visitors and Scilly residents, journalists and diplomats, all brought together by this unusual event. The media coverage was extensive. British television news ran stories that evening. Newspapers published articles the next day. The story spread internationally. American papers picked it up. Australian news covered it. The story was translated into multiple languages. Around the world, people learned about the forgotten war and smiled at the peaceful resolution. The tone of the coverage was universally positive. This was a feel-good story in an era that needed them. 1986 was still the Cold War era. Reagan and Gorbachev, nuclear tensions, regional conflicts in Central America, Afghanistan, Africa. The world was a tense place. So a story about a centuries-old war ending peacefully, about friendship and humor, overcoming bureaucratic oversight, was welcome relief. The ceremony also served practical diplomatic purposes. It strengthened the bonds between the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. It generated positive media coverage for both. It showcased the Dutch government's willingness to engage creatively with history and with smaller communities. It demonstrated that diplomacy doesn't always have to be serious and formal, that sometimes a light touch and a sense of humor can achieve important goals. For the Isles of Scilly, the event was a tourism bonanza. The international media coverage introduced millions of people to the islands who had never heard of them before. The story made the islands seem charming, quirky, historically interesting. Tourism inquiries increased. Bookings went up. The peace treaty signing ended up being one of the best marketing events the islands had ever experienced, all generated by a historian's curiosity and a forgotten document in an archive. The peace treaty itself was preserved as an historical document. Copies were made. One was kept in the local archives on Scilly. One was sent to the Dutch National Archives. The treaty became part of the historical record, formally closing a chapter that had been open for 3 centuries but that nobody had noticed. In the years since, the 1986 peace treaty signing has become part of Scilly's identity. It's mentioned in tourist guides. It's a story told to visitors. It's a source of local pride. The islands that were technically at war for longer than any other place in history are now known for their peaceful resolution of that conflict. It's a lovely bit of historical irony. Part 10. Legal and Historical Questions. Now, let's dig into some of the legal and historical questions raised by this case. Because while the story is entertaining, it also presents some genuinely interesting puzzles for international law and historical interpretation. First question. Was this really a war? From a legal perspective, it depends on how you define war. The Dutch Republic officially declared war on the Isles of Scilly in 1651. This was a formal act of state. It was recorded in official documents. Under the legal theories of the time, this created a state of war. But what does a state of war mean without actual warfare? Modern international law distinguishes between different levels of conflict: war, armed conflict, military engagement, use of force. Each has different legal implications. The UN Charter restricts the use of force between nations, but in 1651, these modern legal frameworks didn't exist. The concept of war was looser, more flexible. A declaration of war was primarily a statement of intent and a change in legal status. It meant that normal peaceful relations were suspended. It gave legal cover for military action. It signaled hostility. But if a declaration of war is made and then no military action follows, what exactly exists? Technically, a legal state of war. Practically, nothing. This gap between legal status and practical reality is the core of the absurdity. The law said war. Reality said peace. For 335 years, this contradiction existed without anyone noticing or caring. Second question. Did the declaration of war remain valid after the royalist government that was its target ceased to exist? This is a genuinely tricky legal question. The Dutch declared war on the Isles of Scilly as controlled by royalist forces under Sir John Grenville. Within months, that government was defeated and replaced by parliamentary control. Did the declaration of war transfer to the new authorities, or did it become void? International law would suggest that declarations of war are against states or territories, not specific governments. If that's correct, then the change in government shouldn't matter. The war was against the Isles of Scilly, regardless of who controlled them. But this raises another question. Were the Isles of Scilly a state? They weren't independent. They were part of England. So was the Dutch declaration really against the islands as a political entity, or against the royalist forces based there? The fact that the Dutch didn't declare war on England as a whole, only on Scilly, suggests they were targeting specific actors rather than a state. This might mean the declaration should have been considered void once those actors were removed from power. But nobody made this argument at the time because nobody was paying attention. And by the time anyone thought about it seriously in 1986, it was simpler to just sign a peace treaty than to argue about whether the war had been legally valid in the first place. Third question. What about all the peace treaties between the Dutch and the British after 1651? Shouldn't those have implicitly ended the state of war with Scilly? This is a strong argument. The Treaty of Westminster in 1654 formally ended the First Anglo-Dutch War. Surely that should have covered all outstanding hostilities between the two nations, including the forgotten declaration against Scilly. The counter-argument is that the Treaty of Westminster was between the Dutch Republic and the English Commonwealth, dealing with specific issues of that conflict. The declaration against Scilly predated that war and wasn't explicitly addressed in the treaty. If we go by strict legal interpretation, something not explicitly terminated remains in force. But this seems like an overly pedantic reading. A reasonable interpretation would be that comprehensive peace treaties between nations should end all subsidiary hostilities unless explicitly preserved. The reality is that nobody thought about the Scilly Declaration when negotiating later treaties because it had been completely forgotten. If someone had remembered, it almost certainly would have been included in the comprehensive settlements. The fact that it wasn't mentioned doesn't necessarily mean it remained valid, just that nobody remembered to address it. Fourth question. What were the actual legal implications of the technical state of war? Could the Dutch have theoretically enforced wartime rights? Could they have blockaded the islands, seized vessels, demanded reparations? Almost certainly not, for several reasons. First, such actions would have been acts of war against the United Kingdom, of which Scilly was part, regardless of the technical status of the old declaration. Britain would have responded forcefully. Second, the doctrine of desuetude in law suggests that legal provisions that aren't enforced for very long periods can lapse. A war declaration unused for 3 centuries would likely be considered void through non-enforcement. Third, international norms had changed dramatically. By the 19th and 20th centuries, arbitrary military action without active conflict would have violated international law and norms regardless of old declarations, so the technical state of war had no practical enforceability. It was a legal ghost, existing on paper but without substance. This is why it could be forgotten so completely, and why its discovery was treated as a curiosity rather than a serious legal matter. Fifth question. Why didn't anyone notice earlier? 335 years is a long time. The Dutch and British governments maintained diplomatic relations throughout. They signed treaties. They exchanged ambassadors. They maintained archives. How could this slip through the cracks for so long? The answer lies in the volume and complexity of historical records. Both the Dutch and British archives contain millions of documents spanning centuries. Treaties, declarations, correspondences, reports, all stored in various locations, catalogued with varying degrees of thoroughness. Nobody had reason to dig through mid-17th century Dutch naval records looking for unresolved declarations. The document existed but buried under layers of other material. Additionally, the specific nature of the declaration, against the Isles of Scilly rather than against England, made it easy to overlook. It wasn't part of the main narrative of Anglo-Dutch relations. It was a side note, a minor incident during a chaotic period. Historical research tends to focus on major events and main narratives. Obscure declarations against tiny islands don't make the cut unless someone specifically looks for them. Roy Duncan found it because he was specifically researching the history of the Isles of Scilly during the Civil War period. He was looking at the islands as the focus of his research, not as a footnote to larger events. This gave him reason to examine documents that broader histories would skip over. His local, specialized focus allowed him to see what generalist researchers had missed. Sixth question: does this war actually hold the record for longest war? This depends on how you count. If we measure by time between declaration and formal peace treaty, yes, 335 years is probably the record. But if we measure by duration of actual fighting, it's 0. If we measure by significant impact, it's also 0. The claim to be the longest war is technically true, but substantively misleading. Some might argue that conflicts like the Reconquista at 780 years are longer. But the Reconquista wasn't a single continuous war. It was a series of conflicts over centuries between various Christian and Muslim kingdoms. There were long periods of peace, truces, alliances that crossed religious lines. It's better understood as a long-term process than a single war. The 335 Years' War is unique because there was a single, identifiable declaration of war and a single, identifiable peace treaty with nothing in between. In that narrow sense, it does hold the record, but it's a record that highlights the difference between legal formalities and meaningful reality. Part 11. What makes a war real? This brings us to a fundamental philosophical question. What makes a war real? Is it the formal declarations, the actual fighting, the consequences for people's lives, the legal status? This question might seem academic, but it has practical implications for how we understand and respond to conflicts. Consider the elements we typically associate with war: armed combat, casualties, destruction, political objectives pursued through force, mobilization of resources and populations, changes in territory or governance, lasting impacts on societies. By these measures, the 335 Years' War was not a war at all. It was a declaration without substance, a legal status without reality. But declarations matter in some contexts. When the United States declared war on Japan after Pearl Harbor, the declaration itself was significant. It formally changed the legal status of the relationship between the nations. It authorized the government to take actions that would be illegal in peacetime. It mobilized the entire society for war effort. The declaration wasn't the war itself, but it was a crucial step in initiating the war. Similarly, peace treaties matter. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just recognize that fighting had stopped. It established terms, assigned responsibility, set reparations, drew new borders. Treaties create new legal and political realities. They're not just paperwork, they're consequential. So maybe the question isn't whether declarations and treaties matter in absolute terms, but whether they matter when divorced from actual events. A declaration of war that leads to warfare is meaningful. A declaration of war that is immediately forgotten and never acted upon is essentially meaningless, regardless of its technical legal status. This suggests that war is ultimately about violence and its consequences, not about paperwork. The essence of war is people dying, infrastructure being destroyed, societies being disrupted, trauma being inflicted. When these things happen, we have war, whether or not it's formally declared. When these things don't happen, we don't have meaningful war, even if paperwork says we do. The Syrian civil war has killed hundreds of thousands despite never having a formal declaration of war. The violence is undeniably real. The conflict is undeniably a war. The lack of formal declarations doesn't change the reality of what's happening on the ground. Conversely, the 335 Years' War had formal declaration and formal peace treaty, but no violence and no impact. The paperwork doesn't make it a real war. This understanding should inform how we think about and respond to conflicts. We should focus on substance over form. When evaluating whether intervention is needed, whether humanitarian aid is necessary, whether peace processes should be pursued, what matters is the actual suffering and violence, not the legal status. A frozen conflict without active fighting but with populations displaced and divided still needs attention, even if nobody's formally at war. A forgotten technical state of war without any actual hostility needs nothing but a signature to clean up the paperwork. The 335 Years' War also reveals something about how we remember conflicts. Wars that cause suffering are remembered. Wars that change history are studied and commemorated. Wars that affect real people's lives become part of collective memory and national identity. But a war that nobody notices, that has no impact, that is completely divorced from people's experience, is not remembered. It's forgotten because there's nothing to remember. No stories of sacrifice, no battles to commemorate, no losses to mourn, just a document in an archive. This is actually hopeful in a way. It suggests that what makes war significant and memorable is not the legal machinery, but the human experience. If we can find ways to resolve conflicts without violence, those conflicts will fade from memory, just as the 335 Years' War did. The goal should be to make all wars as forgettable as this one, not by ignoring them, but by resolving them peacefully before they cause suffering. The ideal conflict is one where tensions are addressed through diplomacy, where grievances are resolved through negotiation, where the only record that remains is paperwork in archives that future historians might find curious, but that never caused anyone pain. The 335 Years' War is an accidental example of this ideal. Through complete neglect and forgetting, rather than through wise policy, a declaration of war never became actual warfare. Of course, we can't rely on forgetting as a conflict resolution strategy, but we can learn that formal peace is less important than practical peace. That what matters is whether people are safe, whether they can live normal lives, whether they're free from violence. If these conditions exist, the paperwork can wait. And if the paperwork never gets done, as with the Isles of Scilly, life goes on just fine. Part 12. Modern Parallels and Lessons. So what can we learn from the 335 Years' War that's relevant today? Are there modern situations that parallel this forgotten conflict? What lessons should we take away? Let's explore the contemporary relevance of this historical curiosity. First, consider the phenomenon of zombie laws and regulations. These are legal provisions that remain technically in force long after they've become obsolete, irrelevant, or absurd. In many jurisdictions, you can find laws on the books prohibiting things that nobody does anymore, or requiring things that no longer make sense. Laws about hitching posts for horses in front of buildings. Regulations about telegram services. Prohibitions based on long outdated social norms. These zombie laws usually cause no problems because nobody enforces them. They're forgotten, just like the war declaration. But occasionally, someone discovers them and either enforces them in bad faith or makes a show of officially repealing them. The process of cleaning up outdated laws is ongoing in many countries. Legal codes need maintenance and updating to remove provisions that no longer serve any purpose. The 335 Years' War was essentially a zombie law in international relations. It existed on paper, but was completely inactive and irrelevant. The 1986 peace treaty was a form of legal housekeeping, cleaning up an outdated provision. This kind of maintenance is actually important, even when the practical impact is minimal. It keeps legal systems coherent and prevents malicious or confused actors from weaponizing technicalities. Second, consider international disputes that are technically unresolved, but practically dormant. There are numerous territorial disputes around the world where countries maintain official claims but make no active efforts to pursue them. Britain and Argentina both claim Antarctica territories, maintained by the Antarctic Treaty System. Various nations have overlapping claims in the South China Sea, some active and some dormant. Historical border disputes that haven't been formally resolved, but where both sides accept the status quo. These situations are similar to the Scilly situation in that legal status and practical reality diverge. Most of the time, this causes no problems. People and governments operate based on reality rather than legal technicalities. But occasionally, these dormant disputes can be activated, often by nationalist politicians looking to distract from domestic problems, or by changing strategic calculations that make previously worthless territory suddenly valuable. The lesson from the 335 Years' War is that it's better to formally resolve disputes even when they seem dormant. Don't assume that because something hasn't been a problem for a long time, it won't become a problem in the future. The peace treaty signed in 1986 was unnecessary from a practical standpoint, but valuable from a legal and symbolic standpoint. It provided closure. It eliminated even the remote possibility of someone attempting to activate the old declaration maliciously. It demonstrated that formal processes have value beyond their immediate practical impact. Third, consider the role of historians and archivists in maintaining institutional memory. Roy Duncan's discovery was only possible because archives exist and historians care about obscure details. Without people who preserve records and study them carefully, we would have no memory of our collective past. We would make the same mistakes repeatedly. We would forget our obligations and agreements. We would lose track of who we are and how we got here. The 335 Years' War reminds us that historical research isn't just about major events and famous people. Sometimes the most interesting stories are in the footnotes, in the obscure records that nobody thought important enough to highlight. And sometimes those obscure stories reveal truths about how human institutions work, or fail to work. Duncan's research wasn't earth-shattering in its implications, but it was valuable. It told us something about international relations, legal systems, and human fallibility. It gave us a story worth telling. In our modern era of digital records and massive data accumulation, the challenge is shifting from preservation to discovery. We're creating more records than ever before, but finding specific information in that vast sea of data can be extremely difficult. Future historians might face the opposite problem from past historians. Instead of too few records, they'll have too many. The skill will be in knowing what to look for and how to find it among the terabytes of data we're generating daily. Fourth, consider the power of humor and creative approaches in diplomacy. The 1986 peace treaty signing could have been handled differently. The Dutch could have simply sent a note acknowledging that the war declaration was obsolete and should be considered void. That would have been the bureaucratically efficient approach. Instead, they sent the ambassador, held a ceremony, and created a media event. This generated vastly more value. It strengthened relationships. It created goodwill. It got positive press coverage. It showed that diplomacy doesn't always have to be dry and formal. Modern diplomacy often suffers from being too serious, too formal, too focused on protocol. There's a place for seriousness, certainly, especially when dealing with active conflicts and real grievances. But there's also value in lighter touches, in creative approaches, in finding ways to make diplomatic engagement more human and accessible. The Scilly Peace Treaty is an example of diplomacy done with humor and creativity, and it worked beautifully. Fifth, consider how we tell historical stories and what stories we choose to tell. The 335 Years' War is inherently entertaining. It's funny, it's surprising, it has a satisfying conclusion. This makes it easy to tell and easy to remember. But there's also a risk that entertainment value can overshadow more important but less entertaining histories. How many actual wars, wars that killed thousands or millions, are less well known than this non-war? How many serious conflicts, frozen disputes with real human consequences, get less attention than this amusing anecdote? The fact that we can laugh about the 335 Years' War is only possible because nobody suffered. But we need to maintain perspective. Entertainment is valuable, but we can't let the entertaining stories crowd out the important ones. At the same time, there's value in stories that make history accessible and engaging. The 335 Years' War can serve as a gateway. Someone who learns about this forgotten war might become interested in the English Civil War, in Dutch naval history, in international law, in the Isles of Scilly themselves. Entertainment and education aren't opposites. The best historical storytelling does both. Sixth, consider the importance of maintaining relationships even when there's no immediate necessity. The Dutch and the Scilly Islanders had no conflict in 1986. There was no reason for the Dutch ambassador to visit the islands, no pressing need for a peace treaty. But maintaining relationships, celebrating shared history, finding excuses for positive engagement, these all serve long-term interests. They build social capital. They create networks of goodwill that can be valuable when actual problems arise. This applies to personal relationships as well as international ones. We shouldn't only reach out to people when we need something from them. We should maintain connections, celebrate milestones, find reasons for positive interaction, even when there's no immediate practical purpose. The peace treaty signing was, in this sense, relationship maintenance. It kept the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly connected, however tenuously. It created a shared story and a shared memory. These things have value that's hard to quantify, but very real. Part 13. The broader context of forgotten wars and conflicts. The 335 Years' War is unique, but it's not the only forgotten or obscure conflict in history. Let's explore some other examples of wars and disputes that fell into obscurity, and what patterns emerge from these cases. The War of the Stray Dog, 1925, between Greece and Bulgaria, started when a Greek soldier chased his runaway dog across the Bulgarian border and was shot by Bulgarian sentries. Greece invaded Bulgaria in response. The conflict lasted 10 days before the League of Nations intervened and imposed a ceasefire. Greece was forced to pay reparations. This war is barely remembered today, overshadowed by the larger conflicts of the 20th century, but it demonstrates how quickly minor incidents can escalate into international conflicts when tensions are high and institutions are weak. The Aroostook War, 1838 to 1839, between the United States and Britain over the border between Maine and New Brunswick. Lumberjacks from both sides clashed in the disputed territory. Militias mobilized. Both governments sent troops to the region, but cooler heads prevailed. A diplomatic solution was negotiated. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 formally settled the border. No actual battles occurred, though several people died in related skirmishes. This is another example of a conflict that could have become serious, but was resolved before major violence erupted. The Pig War, 1859, between the United States and Britain over the San Juan Islands in the Pacific Northwest. We mentioned this briefly in the football war script. An American farmer shot a British pig that was eating his potatoes. This triggered a dispute over which country owned the islands. Both sides sent military forces. At the peak, there were several hundred troops facing each other, prepared for combat. But again, no shots were fired. The dispute was eventually submitted to international arbitration. The German Emperor Wilhelm I ruled in favor of the United States in 1872. The islands became American territory without any bloodshed beyond the unfortunate pig. The Toledo War, 1835 to 1836, between the state of Ohio and the territory of Michigan, over a strip of land that included the city of Toledo. Both sides raised militias. There were confrontations and arrests, but no actual battles. The federal government imposed a solution. Michigan gave up its claim to the Toledo Strip in exchange for the Upper Peninsula, which turned out to be a very good deal, given the mineral wealth discovered there later. One person may have been killed in the conflict, though accounts vary. This internal American dispute is barely known today outside the region. What do these conflicts have in common with the 335 Years' War? Several patterns emerge. First, many conflicts are triggered by seemingly trivial incidents. A runaway dog, a dead pig, a disputed bucket in medieval Italy, soccer matches in Central America. These triggers are not the real causes of conflict. They're flashpoints that ignite existing tensions, but they often get remembered as the cause of the war, which obscures the deeper structural issues. Second, many conflicts are resolved without major violence when there are strong institutions or determined individuals committed to peaceful resolution. The League of Nations, despite its ultimate failure, did prevent the Stray Dog War from escalating. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty resolved the Aroostook War. International arbitration settled the Pig War. Federal authority imposed a solution to the Toledo War. The 335 Years' War never became violent because both sides simply forgot about it, but it was finally resolved because one historian cared enough to bring it to attention, and both governments were willing to participate in closure. Third, the conflicts that are remembered are generally those that either caused significant suffering or that changed history substantially. The minor wars, the ones that were resolved quickly or that never escalated to serious violence, tend to fade from collective memory. This creates a distorted view of history where war seems more inevitable and more consequential than it often is. We forget the conflicts that were avoided or quickly resolved and remember only the catastrophic ones. Fourth, geography and timing matter enormously. Conflicts in peripheral areas or during periods when global attention is focused elsewhere are more likely to be forgotten. The 335 Years' War involved a tiny archipelago during chaotic periods of European history. Nobody was paying attention to Scilly when they had English civil wars, Dutch independence struggles, and later global conflicts to worry about. Similarly, The Aroostook War happened in a remote border region. The Toledo War was an internal American dispute that international audiences would never hear about. Fifth, the gap between legal status and practical reality is common in international relations. Many disputes are technically unresolved, but practically dormant. Many agreements are technically in force, but practically ignored. The formal machinery of diplomacy and law often lags behind or diverges from actual practice. This gap is usually harmless, but can occasionally be exploited, or can cause confusion when someone decides to strictly enforce technical provisions that everyone has forgotten about. Part 14. Conclusion and Final Reflections. So we've journeyed through 335 years of forgotten war. From Admiral Tromp's frustrated declaration in 1651, through centuries of complete oblivion, to Roy Duncan's discovery and the peace treaty signing in 1986. We've explored the English Civil War context, the strategic importance of tiny islands, the nature of international law, the meaning of war itself, and the lessons this absurd story teaches us. What should we take away from all of this? Let me offer some final thoughts. First, history is full of surprises. We think we know what happened in the past. We've learned the major events, the famous dates, the important people. But there are always stories we haven't heard, documents we haven't read, connections we haven't made. Every archive contains surprises waiting to be discovered. Every historical period has aspects we don't fully understand. Curiosity and careful research can reveal remarkable things, whether it's a forgotten war or some other overlooked piece of the human story. Second, institutions and processes matter, but only when connected to reality. The Dutch Declaration of War was a formal institutional act. It followed proper procedures. It was recorded in official documents, but without any connection to actual events, to real conflict, to practical consequences, it became meaningless. Similarly, the peace treaty in 1986 was a formal process that acknowledged a legal status, but its real value was symbolic and relational, not practical. We need institutions and processes, but we also need to ensure they serve real purposes and remain connected to the lives of actual people. Third, peace is more than the absence of formal war. The Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly were technically at war for 3 centuries, but lived in complete peace. They traded, communicated, and maintained friendly relations. This demonstrates that practical peace, the ability of people to live their lives without violence and fear, is what truly matters. Legal declarations are secondary. Our focus should always be on creating and maintaining conditions where people are safe and free, regardless of what documents say. Fourth, closure has value even when practically unnecessary. The 1986 peace treaty didn't change anyone's life. Nobody on Scilly was in danger from the Dutch. Nobody in the Netherlands had hostile intentions towards Scilly. The practical situation would have been identical with or without the treaty, but the treaty still had value. It provided a sense of completion. It turned an amusing historical anomaly into a positive story of friendship. It demonstrated that loose ends can be tied up. Sometimes finishing something properly is worth doing, even when it's not strictly necessary. Fifth, humor and creativity have places in serious endeavors. International relations, law, diplomacy, these fields are often treated with extreme seriousness. And rightly so. When dealing with actual conflicts, real grievances, life and death matters. But there's also room for lighter approaches, for finding joy and humor in our shared humanity, for using creativity to build connections. The Scilly Peace Treaty ceremony was handled with humor and warmth, and this made it more effective as a diplomatic tool, not less. We don't have to choose between seriousness and joy. We can have both. Sixth, small places and ordinary people have stories worth telling. The Isles of Scilly are tiny, remote, economically marginal from a global perspective. But they have history. They have stories. The people who lived there over 3 centuries had lives that mattered, loves and losses, dreams and disappointments, the full range of human experience. We often focus our historical attention on great powers, famous individuals, major events, but there's richness in the margins, in the small places, in the ordinary lives. Roy Duncan's research into a small archipelago revealed a story that captivated the world. Never assume that a place or person is too small to have an interesting story. Seventh, war and peace are ultimately about human choices. The 335 Years' War happened because Admiral Trump made a choice to declare war. It ended because Roy Duncan made a choice to bring it to attention, and the Dutch government made a choice to participate in ending it. Every conflict, every peace, comes down to human decisions. We're not prisoners of historical forces beyond our control. We can choose war or peace, violence or negotiation, hatred or friendship. The structures and institutions we create matter, but they're ultimately tools that humans use to implement their choices. The 335 Years' War is, in the end, a story about the gap between formality and reality, about the imperfections of human institutions, about how easily things can be forgotten, and about how satisfying it can be to bring proper closure to even the most absurd situations. It's a story that makes us smile, and that's valuable in itself. But it's also a story that teaches us about war, peace, memory, and the human condition. 335 years. No battles, no casualties, no consequences. Complete forgetting followed by peaceful resolution. It's the best kind of war, the kind that isn't really war at all. The kind where everyone walks away smiling. The kind that reminds us that while conflict is part of human nature, so is the ability to let go of grievances, to see absurdity in our own seriousness, and to choose peace even when war has been declared. In an ideal world, all wars would be like the 335 Years' War, declared perhaps in moments of frustration, but never prosecuted, forgotten because they never mattered, ended with champagne and laughter. We don't live in that ideal world. Real wars happen. Real people suffer and die. Real conflicts tear societies apart. But the story of the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly reminds us that peace is always possible, that conflicts don't have to escalate, that closure can come even centuries late, and that sometimes the best way to end a war is simply to remember that humanity and humor matter more than pride and paperwork. So here's to Admiral Trump, who declared a war he didn't really want to fight. Here's to the Royalists of Scilly, who never knew they were at war with the Dutch. Here's to generations of islanders and Dutch citizens who lived their lives in peace despite the technical state of war. Here's to Roy Duncan, who discovered the forgotten war and turned it into something beautiful. Here's to the Dutch ambassador who traveled to Scilly with a sense of humor and goodwill. And here's to all of us who can learn from this absurd story that peace is not just possible, but natural when we choose to make it so. The longest war in history ended with handshakes and champagne. May all wars end so well. May we all have the wisdom to choose peace over conflict, to resolve grievances through talking rather than fighting, and to remember that at the end of the day, we're all human beings sharing this small planet, and we're far better off as friends than as enemies, no matter what the paperwork says. The war is over. Peace has come to the Isles of Scilly, and that's a victory worth celebrating.